Hello, everybody. My name is Jinseok Kim, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at APARC Center, specifically at SNAPL, the Stanford Next Asia Policy Lab. And I'm an economist who studies the relationship between innovation diffusion and population aging. So today, my topic will be exactly that. My topic is innovation diffusion in an aging society, and I bring the evidence from 15 years of smartphone adoption data in Korea. So before I go on, I will talk about the background first. So today we live in an age of technology advancement and diffusion. Every day we have new innovation coming in, and many of these innovations are changing our life dramatically. So for example, we had the smartphones in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, and we know now that the smartphones have changed our life dramatically. Every day we use our smartphones. We use our smartphone to do a lot of things, such as deliver food or call a taxi or the Uber. And these smartphones have changed our life drastically. In the 2020s, we had the AIs come in. And I think a lot of people here might know AI has changed our life dramatically. And we are using AIs for a lot of stuff that we have been using the search engine for. AI is changing the industry, the way we educate, the way we study. So AIs have been changing a lot of aspects of our life. And there's new changes coming in every day. And with the AI, it has been becoming even faster. So what will be next in the innovations? So we have talked about physical AI, which will change our life yet again drastically, because it will touch upon every aspect of our life. So these innovations have been changing our life dramatically, and these are very important elements of our life, day-to-day life. But the thing about technology advancement and progress is that there's another side of the story. While the technology advancement has changed our life drastically and has benefited us by making life more convenient, easier, and easy to maneuver, there are also many others who have difficulty following this trend and these new changes. So there are many people who have been troubled through this inequality in society. So these changes and benefits of the technology advancements have not been equal to all of us. Usually among the elderlies and the low incomes, they have trouble following the trend. They have difficulty in adopting new technology due to their reasons, maybe due to age or because of their low income. So, and this touches upon an important topic in sociology, which is digital divide. So digital divide is a heavily studied topic in demographics, sociology, and economics. So I want to bring in a personal story about digital divide, and this is about my grandmother. So this is a picture of my grandmother showing off her new smartphone that I bought for her. So I'm very close to my grandmother, so I visit her very often. And oftentimes what she would do is she would ask me questions about how to use her smartphones. And this is actually very surprising for me because she's asked questions about very simple tasks that you can do with the smartphones. For example, how to play music on the smartphone, or how to maybe use her search engine to look up something that she wanted to learn about. So these are actually very simple tasks, and it would be very surprising to me because she's actually a very intelligent and smart woman. She actually went to college in her days. And back in Korea in her days, that would be a very significant thing because a lot of the women didn't get to have high-level education at the time. So even though she's a very smart and intelligent person, she would have difficulty maneuvering her smartphone that I bought for her. And that would be very surprising for me. So this would actually get me thinking about why there's a difference between her and me. So is this because of aging? Is it due to her age that she has difficulty in using her smartphone? Is it because of aging that she has more difficulty in accepting and using new technology? Or could it be a generational difference? Because her generation did not have a lot of new technology or digital technology in her days. Is it because of this difference that she has difficulty in adopting new digital technology? And is it because of my generational difference that I am having easier time adopting new digital technology because my generation has had access or accessibility to a lot of new technologies like internet or smartphones? So this would actually bring up an important question that connects to my research question. And this relates to digital divide heavily because I want to see what are the causes of this digital divide in terms of age, generation, or even maybe just period, as in time. So I want to explain more about digital divide. So digital divide, as I just talked about, is the inequality in access or skill or benefits to technology. So there's three different levels of digital divide. The first level of digital divide concerns accessibility, as I just mentioned. So this is talks about whether individuals have basic access to digital technologies. This includes device ownership and connectivity. And much of the early digital divide literature focuses on this dimension, emphasizing gaps in access across income, age, and geography. And the second level moves on to beyond this access to talk about how there's a difference in how effectively individuals use these digital technologies, including frequency, diversity of use, and just basic digital skills. So this will talk about, for example, if we were talking about internet, this would be if people were able to use the internet to search up topics that they're interested in and use the internet to watch videos, things like that. So this moves beyond just access, which is the first level of digital divide. And third level is recently being discussed, and third level talks about the benefits. So this talks about the inequality in social, economic, and welfare benefits gained from digital technology use. So this would be, for example, this would be if we can use the technology like internet, like as I just mentioned, or smartphone, to apply to jobs and get jobs, and so use these technologies for some kind of benefit, or like, as I just said, like benefits like access to job portals, or just getting deliveries from food. So those kind of basic level benefits are included here. Next, I want to talk about population aging, which I just mentioned that is an important topic of my research. So population aging actually touches upon digital divide and connects to digital divide heavily, because as I just mentioned, digital divide concerns heavily with the inequality and difference between the earlier cohorts and the later cohorts. So the difference in ages, the elderlies and the more younger people. So I just mentioned that there's a digital divide between these different groups. And population aging comes into the picture because population aging is causing the society itself to be of higher age on average. So with higher age, as I just mentioned, there's a bigger chance of digital divide occurring. So I wanted to see how population aging would affect digital divide, and how what are the factors of digital divide that causes that for elderlies and for the earlier cohorts to have a difference. And so by looking at this difference and seeing how population aging affects digital divide, I want to see how in the future digital divide will continue on or persist due to, and what the population aging will cause to this digital divide among us. And as I just mentioned in my topic, I will be doing this through looking at smartphone adoption. So these pictures actually show important elements of my study. Because I'm looking at time-related changes to technology adoption, I'm looking at different temporal variables that affect technology adoption and digital divide. So in this picture, you can see the three different temporal variables that I'm looking at. So first is, of course, the age. An age effect talks about the basic differences in technology adoption and digital divide due to age difference. So what are the difference between the elderlies and more the younger population? Maybe even in the middle-aged population. Second is the cohort. So this talks about the generational differences. So if you look at the graph, there's different generations who are born among at the similar time frame. So this looks at how these different cohorts are different in terms of the topic that we want to look at. So in my case, it will be technology adoption. And then the third variable is period. So period talks about the basic captures variation that occurs across calendar time and affects all age groups simultaneously. So period actually looks at how time just affects different age groups and different cohort groups. So just now I have touched upon a very important topic of my research, age, period, and cohort. So this is actually a topic in sociology that is discussed a lot. And this, to be summarized, is called APC analysis. So APC analysis is a robust statistical framework employed to disentangle the simultaneous influences of the chronological age, the historical time periods, and generational cohort effects on various phenomena. And in my case, again, is smartphone adoption. So APC analysis has the unique ability to depict parsimoniously the entire complex of social, historical, and environmental factors that simultaneously affect individuals and populations of individuals. So APC analysis is widely used to address questions of enduring importance to the studies of social change, etiology of diseases, aging, and population processes and dynamics. So as you can see, APC analysis has a lot of applications to the topic of my interest, digital divide and smartphone adoption. So I want to see how this, so in my case, it would be social change, would be smartphone adoption and digital divide, or in general, technology adoption. And I want to see how aging affects this process by looking at how aging effect and generational effect and period effect all contribute to the digital divide and smartphone adoption. So to summarize, my research question is as follows. So my research question is, how do age, cohort, and period forces jointly shape the timing and dynamics of smartphone adoption? And how does the relative importance of these forces evolve over the diffusion process? So basically evolve over time. So I want to see how these three forces affect the dynamics of smartphone adoptions over time and how this changes, because there will be differences in how these attributes, variables contribute to the topic of my interest. And actually, through this topic, I want to see, to look at another question, which is, so what does this result of this analysis mean and predict about technology diffusion in an aging society? So I want to see in the future, as the society ages, as population becomes more high age, what will this mean about technology diffusion in later times where the population is more aged? So through my APC analysis, I want to look at these two questions. And this perspective actually allows me to connect the demographic heterogeneity with the diffusion dynamics and speak directly to debates on whether technology changes primarily reflects generational replacements or broader period-driven shifts. So through my research, I want to make two different kinds of contributions. So first is, of course, the academic contribution. So from an academic standpoint, the contribution is to move beyond the static descriptions of adoption gaps and instead to identify the mechanisms that drive diffusion at different stages. So by decomposing this adoption growth into age, cohort, and period, and so into the three components, the analysis clarifies whether diffusion is primarily shaped by life cycle constraints or generational replacement, or actually just broader environmental change. So how this differs to past studies is that past studies usually focused on analyzing the various determinants of digital divide. For example, this could be demographic differences like education or ages, education and income, and this could be also be economic difference determinants, and etc. So this stride of research looks at the various determinants of what causes digital divide, and also a lot of the APC analysis has focused on topics that are unrelated to technology adoption, such as cancer rates and so etiology. So the limitation of these studies also was that it only had the cross-sectional snapshots, meaning it only looked at specific time periods, and it had weak temporal attribution. So the contribution of this study, therefore, is that I'm looking at a two-stage inequality model that's aligned with theory in terms of digital divide. And I also contribute to giving a temporal explanation with APC discipline. And the next, from a policy perspective, these distinctions matter because different drivers imply very different intervention strategies. So for example, if age effect dominates, the adoption gaps reflect life cycle constraints, such as learning cost or cognitive barriers or habit formation. So in this case, effective policies would focus on age-targeted interventions, such as including digital literacy programs for older adults and simplified interfaces or support services that are lower the cost of adoption later in life. For another example, if the cohort effect dominates, the adoption gap reflects persistent generational differences that are formed earlier in life. So this suggests that inequality is structural and long-lasting, and that policies aimed at younger cohorts, such as education, early exposure, or curriculum based on digital skill development are very important. So in this case, short-term interventions may have limited effects, but long-run investments can permanently narrow the digital divide in the latter run. For lastly, if period effect dominates, adoption is driven primarily by the broader diffusion environment, such as the technological prices, the infrastructure availability, or platform design or institutional support. So this implies that contextual and systematic policies can be highly effective. For example, governments may then focus on shaping the adoption environment through subsidies or infrastructure development, standard seeking, or regulatory reforms that lower adoption barriers across the population, different cohorts. So in this sense, identifying the dominant force behind the adoption dynamics and also behind digital divide is very important because it informs whether digital inequality should be addressed through what kind of intervention should be used to address this digital divide. So should it be demographic targeting, or should it be generational investments, as I talked about, or should it be environmental and institutional change? So these identifying the important influence that causes digital divide will lead to how the government can formulate its policies on mitigating digital divide. So my framework provides a structural way to translate these empirical diffusion patterns into policy relevant guidance for mitigating the digital divide. And I will now move on to the empirical analysis. So first, let's talk about the data, because the data is the most important element of an empirical analysis. So the analysis uses the Korea Media Panel Survey. And this panel survey is a very extensive data set that looks at what the media usage of individuals. And it has been conducted since 2010 by KISTI, which is Korea Informational Society Development Institute. So the time frame of this data spans from 2010 to 2024. And so I look at this whole 15 years of data. And the respondents are ranging from, there's about 7,000 to around 12,000 respondents for each year. And I limited the age group to age 15 and above from 2010. So this data set actually allows me to track who adopts, when they adopt, and how adoption dynamics evolve across demographic groups and over time. So this panel structure allows me to observe individual adoption histories over time, which is essential for modeling first adoption. Specifically, I'm using a discrete time hazard framework. So this is very important. Also, at the same time, the long time horizon and large sample size provides rich variance across ages, across birth cohorts, and for calendar years, which makes the data particularly well suited for my APC analysis framework. So this is the data that I'm using. So next, let's go on to the empirical framework. So I've actually given you hints about the frameworks that about the empirical framework I'm using. So I'm using a combination of APC analysis framework with the discrete time hazard model. So to explain the discrete time hazard model first, the discrete time hazard model is a model that models the first adoption, and it looks at the hazard of this first adoption. So this looks at the probability that a person will adopt, given the fact that this person has not adopted until this year. So this looks at the timing of the first adoption and the determinants and the contributing factors that contribute to this timing of adoption. Next is the APC analysis framework that I've been talking about. So age, period, and cohort. So this equation shows this framework. So Y is a dependent variable that I'm looking at. So for me, it would be the first year of smartphone adoption. Mu is the constant. The A is the age effect. The pi is the cohort effect. And lambda is the period effect. And actually, so this is a common problem in the APC analysis frameworks. And this problem is called the identification problem. So I don't know if you have noticed, but there's actually a linear relationship between age, period, and cohort, where age equals period minus cohort. So if you think about this in terms of data and in terms of empirical analysis, this actually causes a rank deficiency of in the design matrix due to this relationship, because there's a relationship between the three components that I'm looking at. There's actually a rank deficiency. So this causes a difficulty in estimating. So next I show how I solve this or try to bypass this problem through the model specification. So for the first model is the linear HAPC hazard model. So by HAPC, I talk about hierarchical APC model. To go into details. So first, I model smartphone adoption using a discrete time hazard model. So formally, the hazard is the probability that individual I adopts in year T, given that they were at risk at the start of the year. So I estimate this using a logic specification, which is standard for discrete time event history models. So the key part of the model is how adoption is decomposed into age, period, and cohort. So as I talked about, the age term captures the life cycle effects and is centered at the mean age to ease interpretation. The cohort effect here, so the cohort effect talks about captures the percentage generational differences in adoption propensity. And lastly, the period effect by sigma captures the time-specific shocks that affect all individuals in a given year, such as changes in prices or technology quality or institutional context. So here, I modeled the three effects differently as a method of bypassing the identification problem. So this is the hierarchical APC model. So first of all, the cohort and period effects are modeled as random effects. So they are each assumed to follow a normal distribution. So this hierarchical structure allows me to flexibly capture the unobserved heterogeneity across cohorts and over time. So while avoiding the identification problem that arises from treating all APC components as fixed effects. So by capturing the cohort effect and period effect through random effect and capturing the age effect through a fixed effect, I bypass the identification problem. So this model serves as a baseline for my analysis. So let's talk about the model estimation. So this is the first model's estimation results. So this table 1 reports results from a discrete time hazard model on first smartphone adoption with a hierarchical age period cohort structure. Age models acts again as a fixed life cycle effect, while cohort and period are modeled as random effects that captures generational effects and calendar time context. So let's look at the estimated coefficients. So first, age. The coefficient on age is negative and statistically significant, and this indicates that holding cohort and period effect constant, the hazard of the first smartphone adoption declines with age. So this is more intuitive because we basically know that the result shows that the elderly have less probability of adopting a smartphone as opposed to the younger population. So this suggests that smartphone adoption is most likely in the adult life course and becomes less likely as an individual ages. Next, the constant. The constant represents the baseline log odds of adoption at the reference age, and this is averaged across cohort and periods. Its large negative value actually reflects the generally low baseline probability of first adoption, and once age and contextual age effects are taken into account. So next, let's look at the random effects. So the random effects are captured by the cohort variance and the period variance. So if you look at the result, you can see that the cohort variance is much lower than the period variance. What this means, I will talk about period variance and individually. So the period variance is substantially larger than the cohort variance. And this suggests that year-to-year diffusion conditions play a dominant role in shaping the adoption hazards. So the key message here is that this implies that actually changes in the broader diffusion environment, such as technology availability, price, that I've mentioned, are more influential than generational differences in explaining when adoption occurs. And cohort variance is much smaller, which means that the differences between generation play a less role in smartphone adoption. So overall, the linear HAPC model shows that smartphone adoption is shaped by life cycle dynamics, but the period-specific diffusion environments account for more variation than the cohort differences. So next I'm going to show a few graphs that shows each individual effects. So first, I show the age effect using a graph. So this figure plots the predicted probability of first smartphone adoption by age. So this is a linear version of this. So on the x-axis, we have the age, and on the y-axis, we have the predicted hazard. And if you look at the line, you can easily see that with as an individual ages, the predicted hazard of an individual adopting smartphone decreases linearly. And this shows a 95% confidence interval. So, and we can easily see that this has a declining trend, which shows that individuals will be less likely to adopt as they age. So yeah, so this pattern reflects a pure life cycle effect. And this is net of the generational differences and year-specific diffusion conditions. And this also takes into consideration that as age increases, fewer individuals remain at risk of first adoption, which increases certain uncertainty in estimated hazard. Then I look at the period effect. So in the period effect, on the x-axis, we have just the calendar time, and on the y-axis, we have the odds ratio. And 1 is the baseline that we use. So values that are higher than 1 means that they have higher probability of adopting, whereas the values lower than 1 signify that the probability is lower in these results. So we see a sharp rise in period effect in the early 2010s, reflecting the rapid expansion of smartphones, and due to probably a variety of factors, such as just because smartphones have been released, because maybe prices were falling and there's improving network infrastructure, and because a lot of people were starting to adopt over time. And after this initial takeoff, the period effect remains persistently above 1. And this suggests that calendar time conditions continue to favor adoptions even as the market matured. So, and here we see a few dips. These dips actually signified the years that had less favorable environments for smartphone adoption. This could be years where prices surged, or there has been events that have made smartphone adoption difficult for elderly or some population, maybe. And actually, the red line is the lowest period of year. So this smooths out the first line to see the general trend over time. And you can see that in general, the trend is an increasing trend. So over time, you could interpret that over time, the time had a positive effect on adoption hazard. Lastly, I see the cohort effect on smartphone adoption. So this figure shows the estimated cohort effect from the baseline linear HEPC hazard model. The horizontal axis signifies the birth cohort. So from 1900s to the 2000. So I stopped the cohort at 1995, who were 15 at the year of 2010. So this looks like the cohort effects on adoption hazards. And this similar to the period effect, values over 1 signify that the odds ratio, this had a positive effect on the adoption hazard, whereas values lower than 1 had a negative effect on the adoption hazard. So from this graph, several patterns can be seen. So you can see that earlier cohorts, so those born in the 20th century, early 20th century, have substantially lower adoption. So people of let's say, I think it started from 1920. So these people had much lower likelihood of adopting smartphones at any given point in time, even after accounting for their age and period effects. So this is because of their cohort effect, so generational differences. Adoption propensity rises steadily for cohorts born from roughly from 1930s to 1960s. This peaks among cohorts who entered adulthood during the early stages of the digital era. So for example, the 1970s to 1980s. So it could be explained because these generations had access to digital technology and smartphone during their early 20s or to late 20s, which were ages that they have access to smartphones and also have the economic income to purchase these new technology. So for cohorts born after the 1970s, the estimated cohort effect begins to decline and converge toward the reference level. So this likely reflects the fact that smartphones become near universal for those younger cohorts, leaving less scope of cohort-based differences once the period effects are accounted for. So overall, this pattern indicates clear generational stratification in adoption propensity, with cohort effects playing important role during the early and middle stages of diffusion, but diminishes as adoption becomes widespread. So next, I look at the nonlinear model. So this is because I want to capture age effect as a nonlinear variable. And this is because while the linear model has captured that the age had a negative effect on adoption hazard, I want to see if there's a difference in different age groups over time. So I want to see if maybe it peaks around 20 to 30s or maybe 30 to 40s. So I want to see if there's a nonlinear trend in the age effect. So I do this with different with the nonlinear HEPC hazard model. So here the hazard definition remains the same. I continue to model the probability of first time smartphone adoption in a given year, conditional on not having adopted previously. So the key difference here is that age is no longer restricted as a linear effect, but it can. So I allow the age profile adoption to be fully flexible by modeling age as a smooth nonlinear function. So specifically, age enters the model through a function. In here, I use the spine function. So here, fx is approximated using the spine basis functions, and this allows the adoption risk to vary non-monotonically over the life cycle. So for example, it could be rising in the early adulthood or peaking at midlife and declining at older ages without imposing these patterns a priori. So importantly, the cohort and period effects remain unchanged. They are still modeled as the random effects, while just making the fixed effect modeling of age effect as a function. So this model serves as a robustness check and provides a more realistic characterization of life cycle adoption behavior before moving on to the next part of the analysis. So let's look at the estimation results of model 2. So here, table 2 shows the results of the estimation. So here we can see the effects of modeling age as a nonlinear effect. So the age effect coefficients jointly indicate a highly nonlinear life cycle pattern in the smartphone adoption. So rather than declining smoothly with age, as you can see, it does not decline smoothly. The probability of first adoption varies across distinct stages of the life course, with periods of increasing and decreasing adoption propensity. The random effects, the cohort variance and the period variance, actually largely remain the same as with the results of the first model. So here we can see again that period variance is much higher than the cohort variance. So this indicates that period variance or period effect had a much dominating effect over the cohort variance or the cohort generational effect. Second thing that I want to mention in this result is that I haven't mentioned in the first model, but the second model actually has a much higher model fit. So this indicates that the modeling age as a nonlinear effect is more accurate and gives us a more accurate reflection of the data. So this shows that looking at the age as a nonlinear effect is better than looking at it as a linear effect. So I'm just going to show the difference between the nonlinear model and the linear model in this case for the age effect, because the variance of cohort and period was largely the same for looking at the random effect of these two effects in the linear and nonlinear model. So look, so I show the difference between the two models in terms of age effects. So this figure plots the predicted probability of first smartphone adoption as a function of age based on linear and nonlinear HPC model. So the downward sloping slope in the nonlinear model shows again the declining trends of adoption hazard with age. But if you look at the nonlinear model, you can see that there's actually a peak around the age of 30 to 40, and then it declines stably after that age. So you can see that there's a nonlinear structure in the effect of age on adoption hazard. So until now, I have observed and examined the effects of these three effects individually: the age effect, the cohort effect, and period effect. So now I want to see how these contribute to the adoption growth of smartphone over time. So what this does is actually I'm comparing the relative importance of these three effects to see how the importance of these effects evolve over time. So what I analyze here is year-to-year adoption growth and how it can be broken down into these three structural components: age, cohort, and period. So the key idea here is that observed adoption growth in any given year is not driven by a single factor, but by all three factors. So these factors all combined have a combined influence and of population composition and the broader diffusion environment. So the population composition change as cohort replace one another and as an individual age, while period conditions evolve through external and time-varying shocks. So what this decomposition shows is the direction of and magnitude of each effect of each component over the year. This is so next I show the method to doing this. So first of all, I can do this just looking at the pure effects of each age and period and cohort. But the important thing to notice here is that age, period, and cohort are actually interdependent. So these the effects of age, period, and cohort might be intertwining, so they have overlapping effects. So what I want to do is disentangle this overlapping effects and to see the individual contribution of each effect to the adoption growth of smartphone. So what I do is to employ the Shapley value method to explaining how these intertwining effects could be disentangled. So I use the Shapley value method, and the Shapley value comes from the cooperative game theory, and it provides a rule for fairly allocating a total outcome across multiple contributors. And it does this by asking, on average, how much does each component contribute when it is added to a model across all possible orders in which the components can enter. So it looks at how each effect contributes when they enter separately to the model. And it gives an average of this marginal contribution. And therefore, this gives off a disentangled singular effect of each age, period, and cohort. So in this context, the total outcome here is the observed adoption growth. And the contributors are age, cohort, and period effects. So specifically, the Shapley method computes each component's average marginal contribution across all permutations of components. And what this does is this ensures that total contributions sum exactly to observed growth, whereas not using the Shapley value and just decomposing the growth into age and period and cohort will give off a value that is bigger than the observed growth because they have intertwining and interdependent effects. So interaction effects are allocated rather than being arbitrarily attributed. And this is really especially important here because, as I mentioned, age, cohort, and period effects are inherently interdependent. And so their apparent importance depends on modeling order, and simple decomposition can overstate or understate each individual component's effects. So by using the Shapley method, I can ensure that total contribution is sum exactly to the observed growth, and that these interaction effects are properly allocated. So the interpretive advantage of this method is that it allows comparisons of relative importance of each contribution over time. And I can give a fair representation of their contribution without being confused by their entangled effects and interdependent effects. So this distinguishes components that initiate diffusion from those that sustain diffusion as growth slows. So I'm looking at the decomposition of each component's effect over time. So let me begin by showing the basic pattern of adoption growth over time before decomposing its underlying drivers. So if you look at the graph, this shows the textbook pattern of diffusion of technology over time. Adoption rate peaks in the beginning as people start adopting over time. And as the market saturates, the adoption rate declines over time. So you can see that the smartphone market saturated around before 2015 and declined sharply as people all get a smartphone and all adopt smartphones. So the early surge reflects a takeoff phase where adoption expands quickly once initial barriers are overcome, and the late period reflects a transition into maturity, where most high propensity adopters have already entered, and marginal adoption becomes progressively harder. So this figure tells us what happened with the adoption growth of smartphones. It peaks early, and then it declines sharply as the market saturates. So the natural question that comes on into mind next is, what factor, how much of each of this adoption rate has each of these three components, temporal components, age, period, and cohort, how much did they contribute to this adoption growth? So first is the pure contribution to adoption growth without considering their entangled effects. So this is not Shapley value analysis. So this figure shows the general direction and magnitude of each component's contribution to adoption growth in each year. So positive value indicates that a component is pushing adoption upward in that year, while a negative value would be meaning that that this effect had a negative effect on the adoption growth. So if you look at the graph, you can clearly see that period effect is dominating all from the three components. So the period effect, in the beginning, it had a negative phase because, and this is as explained in the period effect graph. In the beginning, it has a lower probability of adopting because there's more of an institutional barrier or infrastructural barrier. But as these barriers are removed, the period effect picks up and increases dramatically, and it contributes to the mostly to the adoption growth. So this suggests that time-specific forces such as technological improvements, cost reductions, and infrastructure expansion were the primary drivers of rapid diffusion in the earlier phase of the market. By contrast, age and cohort effects are smoother and smaller in magnitude, as you can see from the red and blue lines. In the beginning, age effect had a positive effect to adoption growth, while in the latter stages, it dipped down below 0. Age effect contributes modestly early on and then becomes slightly negative. So this consistent with the population aging towards groups with lower adoption propensity. Cohort effects are generally positive, indicating that newer cohorts are more adoption prone, but their contribution alone is not large enough to explain the early surge. So after the mid-2010s, all three components converged towards 0, reflecting a maturation phase, as I explained. Adoption growth slows not because these age effect, cohort effect, or period effect were negative, but just because the market has saturated and because none of them provides a strong expansionary push anymore. So at this stage, we see that period forces ignite diffusion, while demographic forces shape its trajectory more gradually over time. So the final step of analysis is to assess the relative importance of these components using Shapley value. And so this is a way that accounts for their interactions. So this entangles the different effects and gives off a fair allocation of these effects contribution to adoption growth. So age, cohort, and period effects, as I mentioned, are inherently interdependent. The apparent contribution depends on how they are combined. So as I mentioned, to address this, I use the Shapley decomposition, which attributes adoption growth to each component by averaging its marginal contribution across all possible orderings. So this figure shows the results of this analysis. In this figure, the vertical axis represents each component's share of total adoption growth in a given year. And the results actually reinforce and sharpen the earlier findings. You can see again from the graph that the green, the period effect, dominates in the beginning. In the beginning, period effect accounts for almost all, if not almost all of the adoption growth, while actually Asian cohort had a negative effect. And in parts of time over time, age had a negative effect on the adoption growth. Age effects are actually volatile and sometimes negative, and this indicates that population aging alone would not have generated diffusion, and actually population aging has a negative effect on generating diffusion, and in some periods would have slowed it. So cohort effects are consistently positive but secondary, becoming relatively more important in the latter year as period effects weaken. So the Shapley decomposition makes clear that while cohort replacement helps sustain adoption, it is the period that actually forces that fundamentally determines when the diffusion accelerates and when it slows. So this is very consistent to the previous literature, like such as Diffusion of Innovation Theory by Rogers, which explains that actually diffusion has a very easy to understand pattern in that in the earlier years, diffusion of innovation diffusion picks up in the earlier phases where the innovators and the early adopters adopt the innovation. But over time, as the market saturates, the adoption speed slows down and decelerates. And from my results, it can be shown that this is due not because of any of age, period, and cohort, not because they have a negative effect, but because over time, after the market saturates, there are less people to adopt, which makes it new adoption difficult. So after this, I plan to carry on more analysis regarding this framework and this topic. So further analysis, I want to, there's several directions that I can take. So first of all, I want to use proxy variables for period effect. So when I mentioned the explanations for the period effect, I mentioned components or determinants such as technology price or infrastructure, such as network or institutional support. So actually, rather than just using period effects through modeling period effects through calendar time years, I want to use proxy variables such as those that I just mentioned to actually see how each of these variables affect smartphone adoption. Next one, I want to look at different levels of digital divide. As I mentioned, there's 3 levels of digital divide. So in this analysis, in my study that I'm showing to you today, I've showed you the first level of digital divide, adoption and access. But I want to go into more detail and more depth into the first level divide, first of all. So as you guys know, smartphone has different levels of technology, such as 3G, LTE, and 5G. So there has been technology upgrading over time. So regarding this variable, I want to apply a multi-state or event history framework. So this model would be looking at the discrete time hazards for transitions plus a growth transition modeling for that skill that conditions on states. So it's going to look at how individuals go between these different stages of technology, such as from maybe 3G to 5G, or from a picture phone to a 3G, or a picture phone to 5G. So this is looking at how individuals change their state over time in terms of smartphone adoption. So by modeling these differences and in more detailed technology adoption of smartphone, I want to see how, again, age, period, and cohort affect these transition between stages of technology. And lastly, as I talked about, I want to look at how the age, period, and cohort affects the second level of digital divide, which is skills. So this would be looking at how age and period cohort affects people's skill in using a smartphone. So this would be discerning how is it age differences is it because of age or generation or cohort that there's a difference between skills between individuals. So actually, by doing this second level digital divide analysis, I want to compare this result with the first level digital divide analysis that I just shown you here. So I want to see if there's a difference between whether a specific determinant or component had a dominant effect. So here in the first level, we saw that the period effect had a dominating effect over age and cohort. So I want to see if this is the same or different in second level digital divide. So comparing the two levels of digital divide and comparing how age, period, and cohort intertwine and interplay into the differences between the skills and adoption will be interesting to see. And this would have a lot of implications for policy too. So the key takeaways of my study. So this study combined age, period, cohort framework with the event history modeling to examine smartphone adoption as a dynamic diffusion process rather than a static adoption gap. So the goal is to identify which forces matter and when they matter and why. So this is the framework that I applied to my research topic. Empirically, the results show a clear pattern. We saw that the period effect dominates, as I mentioned, early diffusion, and drives adoption takeoff through the time-specific conditions such as technology quality and prices. and the policy environment. So the cohort effect also matters, but are secondary to period effect. And the generational differences in baseline adoption propensity, particularly in the early and the middle adoption phases, were more important during those phases. The age effects were more modest, and the life cycle related. So it becomes more relevant as diffusion saturates over time. And lastly, the Shapley value decomposition makes it makes it clear that by distinguishing forces that initiate diffusion from those that sustain it. So we saw that in the beginning, period effects were the dominating driver of diffusion and adoption, whereas age effect and cohort effect came into effect in the later stages of diffusion. So these findings translate directly into policy guidance. In the early stage, when the period effect dominates, government have the greatest leverage through their contextual policies, such as infrastructural rollout or affordability standards and regulations. In the middle stages, where age effect and cohort effect becomes more important, the policy should combine environmental support with targeted generational investments, such as education and early exposure, as well as in the late stage, when the adoption slows down. Policy needs to take into consideration of these the slowdown in diffusion by shifting towards age-targeted and skill-focused interventions, including digital literacy, classrooms for elderlies, and usability and support for the older users. So to address these persons in second and third level, these could be also pertinent to the second level and third level digital divide. And so what I want to do next is to use the same framework and apply to second level digital divide, and to see if there's same pattern or different patterns, and to make according policy recommendations with the results. So the core message here is that digital inequality is non-static. The effective policy should depend on which effect dominates in different stages, and on different timing, and on which APC forces dominate at each state of diffusion. With that, I will end my presentation for today. Thank you very much.